Now we're going to take a look at banks and how bank behavior affects the money supply. And we're going to do this by looking at the bank balance sheet. Now, balance sheet simply takes the assets and we subtract from the assets are what the firm owns, liabilities are what the firm owes to others, and that equals owner's equity, or often called shareholders' equity. Okay, that's what's left over. Okay, so if that firm has $100 in assets and they owe $70 in liabilities, there's $30 of shareholders' equity. Now that's probably the most intuitive way to look at a balance sheet, or in this case, a balance equation, an equation of the balance sheet. But another way we often see it is this way. If we add liabilities to both sides, add liabilities to that side, and it cancels out. Add liabilities to that side, and we get assets equal liabilities plus owner's equity. In other words, looking at it this way, we see that here are the firm's asset, and there are two groups who have a claim on the firm's assets. Those the firm owes money to, they have a claim on the firm's assets, and the owners of the firm have a claim on the firm's assets. So you'll often see it this way. Now, for our purposes, that's what you do in financial accounting, right? For our purposes, to illustrate bank behavior, we're not going to worry about owner's equity. And in most cases, in our example, it's not going to be affected anyway. So don't worry about that. Those of you who've had financial accounting, okay, are gonna worry about that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a T account. We're going to put assets on one side, liabilities on the other, and ignoring owner's equity, okay, assets, that leaves us with assets equal liabilities. So in other words, this column has got to equal this column. So that's the approach we're going to take in a minute. Now, there's a couple of things, some definitions. We might as well just get them out up front. We've got to know the meaning of these things. So let's take a look at that. Okay, well, fractional reserve banking. What is that? Well, it's simply, in our banking system, banks hold only a fraction of deposits as reserves. When you deposit money in the bank, they don't just keep it there in a safe. They keep part of it as reserves because, someone might come and ask for their money. They might come and want some cash. They might write a check, right? So they got to keep some as reserves, but they lend out the rest. That's how they make money. You deposit it there. They might pay you a little bit of money for your deposit, but then they turn around and lend it out for mortgages, business loans at a higher rate. And the difference between what they pay you for your money and what they lend it out for is revenue to the bank. That's how they make their money. Okay, so that's called a fractional reserve banking system, where we deposit their money. They keep only a fraction of those deposits as reserves there at the bank. The reserve ratio. Well, this is the actual fraction of deposits the bank holds as reserves. Okay, so, they're going to hold only a part of the money there. Well, this is how much. So this is reserves divided by deposits. That's the reserve ratio. So, for example, let's suppose they have $100 of deposits and they keep $10 as reserves. So their reserve ratio is 10%. Okay, there's our reserve ratio. The reserve requirement. Well, the Federal Reserve Bank regulates banks. One of the regulators of banks. And that's what they were created to do. And we'll more about that later on. But they will, because banks have an incentive to make money, right? They want to make money. So they're going to hold as few reserves as they can and lend out. That allows them to lend out as much as they can, right? But that may not be quite as prudent to do. So the Federal Reserve may step in and say, okay, banks, we're going to require you to hold a minimum amount as reserves. That's a prudent way of doing business, okay? So a reserve requirement is the minimum reserves, the minimum reserve ratio required by the Federal Reserve Bank. And then excess reserves. These are reserves banks hold in excess of a reserve requirement. And it's just reserves minus the reserve requirement. So let's say the reserve requirement is 10%. And the bank is holding, let's say the bank has $100 of deposits and they're holding $20 as reserves. Okay, well, let's do that up here. So their reserve ratio is actually 20%. So that's the situation. The Federal Reserve Bank only requires 10%. They're holding 20%. So the required reserves are 10% of this $100 of deposits. They're required to hold on to $10. But the bank, for whatever reasons we'll talk about later, decides to hold on to 20. So the excess reserves are 10. 20 minus 10, those are the excess reserves. Okay, so we know we were dealing with fractional reserve banking, where banks only hold a fraction of deposits as reserves. The reserve ratio is the amount of reserves divided by the number of deposits, the amount of deposits. That tells you the ratio they're holding. The requirement is set by the Federal Reserve Bank. That's the minimum amount of reserves banks are supposed to keep on hand. And excess reserves are any reserves that banks hold in excess of what they're required to hold. Now we're going to use this T account with assets on the left side, liabilities on the right side, and keep in mind they have to equal each other. And we're going to assume a reserve requirement of 10%. And we're also going to assume no excess reserves. So reserve requirement is 10%, and the bank is going to hold no excess reserves. That'll make it nice and slick. So you deposit $100 in your checking account. This is the bank's T account. These are the bank's books. So what is your $100 to them? Well, it's a couple of things. First of all, it's a liability. It's not their $100. keeps moving. They owe you $100. It's not theirs. It's yours. So they have a liability of $100. But they've also got reserves of $100. That's an asset. So they've got cash in the vault, but they owe you that cash. So they got reserves of $100 and a deposit of $100. It balances. Okay, it balances. So bank's not going to make any money if they keep that the $100 just sitting there in the vault, right? So they're only required to keep 10%. That's the reserve requirement. So they're going to keep 10% as required reserves. That's $10, $10 of this 100. So I'm going to put required reserves as $10. And then what are they going to do? They're going to loan out the rest, 90. So it still balances, right? 10 plus 90 equals 100. So we're good. Again, they're holding no excess reserves. The requirement's 10%. They have to keep 10% of this deposit in the on reserve there, the bank, and they're going to lend out 90. Now let's look at what happened to the money supply. Now going back to when you made your deposit in the bank, you had $100 in cash, right? So the money supply is 100. We're just dealing with your money. And then you put it in the bank, in your checking account. So you exchanged your cash, your currency, for a demand deposit. So currency went down by 100. And demand deposits went up by 100. So what happened to the money supply? Nothing. Okay? It just stays at 100. Okay, so let's M1. Start out as 100. Then the currency went down by 100. Demand deposits went up by 100. So it's still 100. No change in the money supply. But then the bank lends out 90 of it. Someone's running around with $90 in their pocket. Whether that's currency or demand deposit doesn't matter. Let's just say they took it out in cash, okay, just to make it easy. Got to write something there, right? What has happened to the money supply now? It's $190. This is not just theoretical, guys. You've got $100 that you can spend at any time. You can write a check, you can withdraw it. Someone's running around with $90 in their pocket that they borrowed from the bank that they can spend at any time. So the money supply that started out as 100, through the activities, through the normal business operation of the bank, has grown from 100 to $190. Now, it doesn't stop there. Why was this loan made? Why did someone borrow that $90? Well, they're going to borrow it to spend it. So let's take a look. They spend it, and then whoever receives that money as income deposits it in their account. So we've got a deposit of $90, and the bank has reserves of $90, right? But are they just going to keep that $90 sitting there in the safe? No. So they're required to keep 10% of this $90, which would be $9. And lend out the rest. They're keeping no excess reserves, so they're going to lend out the whole thing. Well, they're able to lend out 81. Okay, so it's all in balance here. This side equals this side. And like I said, we're not going to worry about owner's equity. Of course, they're getting interest on the loan, and that goes over the owner's equity, but we're not worried about that because that doesn't have anything to do with, in your financial accounting class, you got to worry about that. But here, we're just showing how bank behavior affects the money supply. So, what happened there? Well, a demand deposit. We start out with $190 money supply, and then currency, whoever received that as that $90, takes that 90 and deposits in their checking account. And there we've got a demand deposit. So there's just an exchange of one form of M1 for another. But then a loan is made for 81. So now someone's running around with 81 bucks in their pocket. So what is the money supply now? Well, we started out with 190. And then currency exchange for demand deposit. But then 81 bucks was lent out. So 190 plus 81. The money supply now is 271. And it doesn't stop there. Guess what? That $81 is spent. Someone receives that as income. That is deposited in the bank, and required reserves of $8.10, right? 10% of the 81, and the rest is lent out. Okay, so that would be how much? That would be $72.90. Still in balance. Left side equals the right side. So that $72.90 is spent. Well, let's see, currency, $72.90, and that's put in the bank. And then $72.90, whoops, and then the rest is lent out. This just keeps going and going and going and going. Okay? And we do this. And see what we do, and part of your homework is to do this until, notice that each round gets smaller and smaller. Okay, look at this. You start with 100, then it's 90, then it's 81. It keeps going down. Then it's $72.90, and I didn't, okay, that's going to, well, here, that's $72.90, and then, that's... part of that is held as reserves, part of it lend out, and then that keeps on going, and then down and down. So each round of lending gets smaller and smaller. The reason it gets smaller and smaller is because each round, part of it's held as required reserves. Part of it's each is siphoned off as required reserves. So eventually, Eventually, this is going to go down to 0. Eventually. After multiple rounds, this is going to fall to 0. So one of your homework assignments is to do that, to make it go all the way to 0. And that should take you roughly, I would estimate, about 3 days. Okay. Okay. And it probably would, because it's just over and over. It would be infinite. Okay. Fortunately, there's another way. A better way is to use what is called the money multiplier. The money multiplier is simply 1 over the reserve requirement. In this case, the reserve requirement is 10%, or 0.10 as a decimal, which means our multiplier is 10. And if we multiply that initial deposit that started it all, this $100, and we got, the money supply grew first to 190, then it grew to 271, and it keeps on growing with each round. I didn't take it too many. I'm assuming you can see where that was going. Each round is going to result in a bigger and bigger money supply, but each round is going to add less and less and less. Well, eventually, when it maxes out, if we just multiply that first deposit by the money multiplier, we can see that the money supply is going to become $1,000. So that $100 money supply, once deposited in the bank, and those multiple rounds of lending occur, it'll become a $1,000 money supply. In other words, it's going to become 10 times that through this multiple round of lending. This process is called multiple deposit creation. Through this multiple deposit creation, this multiple rounds, the money supply goes from 100 to 1,000. Now, what if the reserve ratio equals 20%? What would happen to the money supply? Well, let's first look at what will happen to the multiplier. First of all, let's just think about this. Will the money supply become bigger or smaller? Now, the reserve requirement's gone from 10% to 20%. This means that each round of lending is going to be smaller. That means here, the reserve requirement's going to be 20. That means the loan is going to be 80. That means this number here is going to be 80 instead of 90. Well, I don't know if you saw that. I went over here, and that instead of 90, it's 80, right? Because they can only lend out 80 because they've got to keep $20 as reserves. And so the money supply through that first round grows to 180 instead of 190. You see where this is going? Because banks need to keep more reserves, this multiple deposit creation is going to be less powerful. It's going to create less money. It's through the lending process that the money is created. So there you are. Intuitively, we know the money supply is going to be less. Well, let's see what the multiplier is. 1 over 0.2 equals 5. So by doubling the reserve requirement from 10% to 20%, the multiplier has fallen in half from 10 to 5. So this time, the money supply goes from 100 to 500. Now, I probably don't have to tell you what would happen if it went the other direction. Okay, let's say let's go up here. Let's say that the reserve requirement is now only 5%. Well, let me write it in here. That means when you deposit that money here, that $100 required reserves now are only $5. And the loan, if they're holding no excess reserves, can now be $95. That means this first round over here is going to be 95 for that loan when they lend out. It's going to be 95. So instead of growing only to 190 the first time when it's 10% reserve requirement, and 185 when it's 20% reserve requirement, it's now going to be 195. So we get a bigger bang because why? More of it is being lent out. It's through the loans. It's the loans. So think of it this way. The more lending, tattoo this on your hand, the more lending, the more money supply. The less lending, the less money supply. So a higher reserve requirement means more has to be held as reserves, therefore less lending, therefore less money supply. The lower the reserve requirement, that means less has to be held as reserves, more lending, more money supply. There you go.